The last part for today is rather quick, and that is the awqat an-nahy an as-salah, which is the prohibited times of prayer. So there are no voluntary prayers during these times. He says, بِصَلَاةٍ لَا سَبَبَ لَهَا, like salat al-tasbih. If you're going to pray a prayer that has no cause or no purpose or reason behind it, like salat al-tasbih. Because the prohibition is more stressed than the actual prayer. Right? The cause behind prohibiting and the purpose of the prohibition is greater than, your desire to perform voluntary prayers. And then he says these things are ضعيفة, they're weak, فلا تقاومه, and they cannot be substantiated. As for the things that have a purpose, كتحية المسجد, Salat al-Kusuf, right, when there's an eclipse, al-Istisqa, when you want to pray for rain, and similar prayers, there's two different opinions he mentions. I wouldn't mention them to you, but he mentioned them, so I'll mention what he says. He doesn't go into it. He says the prohibition on prayer in those times, there are 3 times. He says there's 2 riwayas, meaning one, you can perform prayers that have a sabab, tahiyat al-masjid, salat al-istisqa, salat al-kusuf, eclipse prayer. That's one narration in the madhab. The other one, which is the mu'tamid, this is the official one, is that no, you cannot pray anything in the awqat an-nahi. You cannot pray any prayer during prohibited times, except for 4 prayers. Sunnatul Fajr. Right? Because the prohibition begins from the adhan of Fajr and continues until the sun's risen above the horizon. The only voluntary prayer you're permitted to pray is the Sunnah of Fajr, Rak'atay al-Fajr. Or Rak'atayn khalf al-Maqam. After you make tawaf, you can stand behind Maqam Ibrahim and pray Rak'atayn, regardless of the time. Or a janazah prayer after Fajr and after Asr, if there's a need, meaning you are worried that the corpse would be spoiled if it sat around due to heat or something. Or, and of course, this was like, if it's absolute must, and that is to make up an obligatory prayer. Meaning if you miss Salat al-Fajr on time, you can pray it while the sun is during that time of prohibition. 3 times he says, or 3 things, I'm sorry. There are, the times, by the way, are from Salat al-Fajr until the sun's risen above the horizon, the height of a spear, approximately 15 minutes after sunrise. And then when the sun is at its height, zenith, until it falls, which could be about 10 minutes or so. And then after you pray Salat al-Asr until the sun completes its setting. Those are the 3 times of prohibition. So nothing should be done except for those 4 prayers that I mentioned. He says there are some secrets to this, some inner dimensions to these prohibitions. So it's not all just mindless practice, but the inner dimensions here, he mentions 3. That you do not resemble the worshippers of the sun. Now that might not be something that we're accustomed to today. We're not surrounded by them in this society. We have mostly Christians and Jews, Hindus and Buddhists, and whatever else. But the worshippers of the sun were prevalent during that time. And when the sun rises and when the sun sets, when the sun's at its height, those are the times of their ta'zeem, their glorification and veneration of the sun. He also says, تحذير من السجود لقرن الشيطان, right? To avoid prostrating to the horn of shaitan. This was mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ, that the sun rises, and with its rising is the horn of shaitan. So if it rises, then you need to avoid that time. And then when it's at its zenith, the same thing. The horn is with its zenith as well. And when it sets, it also goes with it. He talks about when it's setting. So that's some of the reasoning behind it. The Prophet ﷺ mentioned this, the horn of shaitan is during those times. And then also, I personally like number 3 the best, because this addresses human nature a great deal. These things are kind of can seem at times a little bit beyond the scope of how we live our lives. However, number 3 is, he says the person that's traversing the path to the hereafter is constantly practicing worship and devotion. But if you are fixed on one particular type of worship, it will bring about boredom. Right? If you're just doing one thing all the time, you will find yourself overwhelmed with boredom. It will become old news. So, and also, when you're prohibited from something, when you're stopped from doing something, it increases your nashat, your energy, your desire, your drive. Don't do. No, I want to do. Not allowed. Yeah, I want to. And plus, it gives you a time to rest. I mean, imagine if if there's some, right? It's a beautiful thing in the legislation that there are times that you have to pray. You're not allowed to rest. You have to move in devotion. There are times you're allowed to, permitted, and then there are times that are not. So it's like a built-in resting period, a built-in time to change up, because he says that while you're not permitted to pray during those times, you're not permitted from other forms of worship, like reciting the Quran, like tasbih, not salat al-tasbih, but tasbih, subhanallah, alhamdulillah, those types of words of remembrance. And so the servant, they find themselves moving from one condition to the next, one act of worship to the next. And so the same thing was made in the prayer. The prayer is of various different types, right? We have Fajr, 2 rak'ahs, Dhuhr 4, Asr 4, Maghrib 3, Salat al-Isha 4, Salat al-Taraweeh, whatever, 8, 20, 30, whatever it may be. Various different types, Salat al-Duha, different ways that you pray, different forms of prayer, different things that are said, so that you are continuously renewing your spirits and doing something new. Right? And then also in the prayer you have qiyam, you have qu'ud, you have ruku', you're standing, you're bowing, you're sitting, you're prostrating. Instead of just stationary in one position, you get to move about and change the way you worship Allah, and Allah knows best. And that's where we'll conclude. And tomorrow, inshallah, we'll pick up with Kitab al-Zakat and talk about some of the inner dimensions pertaining to that, as well as some of its various manners. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam ala nabiyina Muhammad wa akhiru da'wana. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine? It's like the other was for how we are. So that's how the control comes in. SubhanAllah. It's not مش غير مقيد. It's very good.